Good afternoon. Welcome to Spying in Plain Sight inside the Military Liaison Missions in East and West Germany. I'm Amanda Olke, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. We are pleased to host this discussion of a most intriguing chapter in Cold War history. We have three speakers today who I will introduce in order of appearance. First, the man who first talked to me about the Military Liaison Missions, our former Spy Museum historian and curator, Dr. Mark Stout. He's going to give some general background on the missions and discuss an artifact from the Spy Museum's collection. Then, my dear German friend, historian Bernd von Kostka, curator at the Allied Museum in Berlin and co-author of Capital of Spies, Intelligence Agencies in Berlin During the Cold War, is going to give us a look at a lot of vehicles, but in particular, one really cool vehicle that they have on display at the Allied Museum, which I got to see in the spring, and that inspired this fun program. And then last, but far from least, Joel Anderson will share some of his personal experiences and photographs as a tour officer at the United States Military Liaison Mission from 1988 to 1991.
Thank you, Amanda. And I'll be brief here because the other two guests are vastly more interesting than I am. But just a couple of comments. My first job in Washington, D.C., I was an Army civilian in the Pentagon. I reported in the summer of 1988. And I was in an office there that was providing sort of the Army input to negotiating a conventional arms control treaty in Europe. Of course, this is a time when there were enormous U.S. and NATO military forces in Europe and enormous Soviet and Warsaw Pact armed forces in Europe. And of course, the epicenter of all of this was really particularly Germany. And the idea was we'd like to negotiate a treaty to bring down those levels. Well, from the very beginning, we knew that this treaty would involve on-site inspections, actually going and seeing Soviet military units and counting what was there. But the thing was that the U.S. military did not have a lot of people who had been up close and personal with the Soviet military. So one day, my office director brought in a man named Colonel Don Stovall, who I learned had been head of the U.S. Military Liaison Mission, an organization I'd never heard of at that point. And that was my sort of first exposure to this. And I got to talk to him on various occasions, and it was really eye-opening. Then several months later, I went on a short TDY to Germany, to the U.S. Army in Europe. And when I arrived there, they handed me a card. And I think we have a slide that shows that card, which is now part of the museum collection. I don't know if we can bring that up or not. Yes, there it is. And it said, hey, if while you're in Germany here, you see the Soviet Military Liaison Mission roaming around, this is what their license plate will look like. Please report it. And I was like, okay, so the Soviets have one here too. And I looked into this more, and probably a vast number of you here know this, but there were three Allied military liaison missions. Brixmis, the British one, which was the big dog with 31 personnel allowed to go into East Germany. The French mission, the Mission Militaire Française de Liaison, which had 18, and the United States bringing up the rear with 14. And of course, because everything in the world of diplomacy involves reciprocity, what that meant is that for each Allied person who was allowed to go into East Germany and do their thing, the Soviets got one who was allowed to roam around West Germany. Now, just briefly, a little bit about how this came to be. So late on in World War II, November 1944, the Brits, the Americans, and the Soviets were discussing and reached an agreement on some of the aspects of how the future occupation of Germany was going to work. And one of the sort of items there was that after the war, the commanding officers of each of the occupying forces would exchange military liaison missions. Well, the war ends, and that doesn't really get implemented at all for quite some time until finally in a series of bilateral agreements involving the Brits, the French, and the Americans are actually last. Between fall 46 and spring 47, these liaison missions get established. And they each of these missions was given really substantial latitude to go all over East Germany, with the exception of some restricted areas, and I'm sure we'll hear some more about this. And this turned initially they would do actual liaison work, dealing with, I don't know, I'm making this up, but issues like, some Soviet soldier gets drunk and drives a truck into the American zone and crashes it, and now what are we going to do? Things of this nature. Some more diplomatic kinds of things as well. But very quickly, the intelligence collection components of this really started to dominate for the Western missions. And there were basically sort of, I would say, three categories of intelligence that they were collecting. One was order of battle. So the organization, the strength, and the equipment of the Soviet, and I believe they also spent some time looking at East German as well, armed forces in Germany. The second was sort of technical collection. The group of Soviet forces in Germany were sort of the latest and the greatest for the Soviet army. And so often the newest equipment would get rolled out there. And so if you wanted to understand what are the latest Soviet developments in tank technology or artillery or whatever it happened to be, these liaison missions were an extraordinarily valuable source. And then the third big one was warning. Right, if the Soviets are going to invade Western Europe, invade West Germany and Western Europe, they're going to have to get ready. And having eyes on the ground on the Allied side is a good way of being aware of this. And I would say that with regard, at least to the technical understanding, the latest developments in Soviet weapon systems, this was probably far and away the best source, consistent source at least, that the U.S. intelligence and Allied intelligence, for that matter, had. The only thing in my mind that would even come close would be the biannual Soviet military parades through Red Square in Moscow. But even there, they're not getting as up close. And in some cases, and perhaps we'll hear more about this, members of liaison missions got extremely close to interesting Soviet equipment. So even that, I think, was a distant second. I guess the last thing I'd say is that the Soviets were doing all this same sort of thing, but the Soviet military liaison missions in West Germany had an additional very important function that, at least as far as we know publicly, the Allied missions never took on, and that was supporting Soviet clandestine operations, supporting Soviet espionage operations in West Germany. So that's a super quick lay of the land of what this is all about. And at this point, I'm very happy to step aside and let, I guess, Bernd is up next, and with some really cool automobiles, which I think were central to the culture of all three of these Allied liaison missions. So over to you, Bernd.
Thank you. Yes, I indeed want to focus on the cars, and especially the very latest car that was used, that is the Mercedes G Wagen. Not because it's a German car, but as Joe will affirm, it was by far the best car that our missions were using. So next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the car can be seen as the most important working equipment of the missions for a couple of reasons. Some of the reasons are they need a strong trust and confidence in the mission car. The car should carry them safely and quickly in sometimes unfriendly off-road areas. The need to escape and disappear quickly when the Stasi spotted or even followed them. And also, one reason is they spend many hours, sometimes sleep and eat inside the car. Joe reminds me that the fact that the equipment in the car is so important in the occasion if they spend the night out there on one of the duty trips. One of them should always stay in the car. That means sleep in the car. So in the summer, obviously, there's a tent. You sleep outside. That's much more comfortable. But at some occasions, the car windows were broken, equipment was stolen out of the car, and for that reason, probably it was said that if you stay overnight and you stay longer and you have to sleep, some of the two mission members had to stay inside the car. Next slide, please. Yeah, here are some examples of the very early cars they were using in the late 40s, early 50s. And you can see it were just normal cars to represent their status and especially their liaison task. So next, please. Yes, and this continued in the 1950s when the only special equipment were things like mobile petrol cans and mobile winch in the trunk of the car. But that was not really special equipment, to be honest. But that started to change in the late 1950s. And so now I will compare the US mission cars in the 1960s with the mission cars in the 1980s and show the development in the nearly 20 years. Next, please. Yeah, let's start with this photo from 1962 showing a mission car that caught fire. And if you look at the car, the size of the car, and then you imagine this extremely long vehicle is going off-road in the GDR, and you get the feeling they wouldn't come that far with this car being off-road in the forest of the GDR. And basically that's true. So next, please. Yeah, here you have the Ford Galaxy sedans that were used in the early 60s. And the mission report from 1964 listed 6 Ford Galaxy sedans that was constructed in 62 and 6 sedans that were made 1 year later. So the very latest model of the Ford Galaxy was used in the early 60s as a mission car, as a tour car. Next, please. And the luxury thing was that they got new cars every year. For example, in 1965, the Potsdam mission received 16 brand new Ford cars to renew their fleet and to replace worn out and wrecked vehicles. Please remember that only 14 people, as Mark just mentioned, were allowed to be part of the USMLM, of the US mission, and 10 cars were accredited. So I would say you can only run six cars in the street. So next, yes. And the mission cars had special modifications. These were, for example, a 35-gallon fuel tank, 2 hooks on the front and on the rear, curtains at the rear window and usually also at the back window, and special switches to, for example, use 1 pair of headlights to turn off the tail lights, to turn off the brake lights, which is very important, and also to operate a completely blackout. Next, please. Yeah, British mission cars had similar modifications, as you can see here. You can see the curtains in the back. But as you can see, sometimes the help of an East German farmer and his horse was needed. Next, please. Yeah, and a real eye-catcher in the 60s, when approximately 220 miles were done in 1 year on approximately 700 to 800 tour days. A lot of those miles were spent on lousy tracks across the fields. But only in the mid-60s, the USM mission chief, Colonel Skowronek, used his private car. It was a Corvette Stingray, as you can see here on the photo, for mission and probably liaison reasons and liaison tours in the GDR. So this car, his private car, never went off-road for this deep in the forest missions, but this one was used to liaison missions. But keep in mind what that means to the East German population. You know, seeing those Stingray Corvette American sports car and compare it with their own Trabant kind of car they were able to receive after waiting time of whatever 15 to 20 years. So it was obviously done on purpose to show the difference between the two systems. Next, please. But the Stasi response to those mission cars was to cope with the modern Western cars and their modifications. The Stasi bought a limited number of West German Mercedes and BMWs in the late 50s and early 60s, as you can see here on the photos. These West German Mercedes and BMW was able to follow the mission cars, but as I just mentioned before, the missions were getting 16 brand new cars every year, and obviously that's something the East German budget, GDR, couldn't finance. So this was not the case in the 70s and 80s anymore, and the number of modern West German cars that was used by the Stasis to follow the missions was very limited. Next, please. Yes, and during the 70s, the USMLM used several kinds of mission cars. And here's only a few examples. It's a Ford LTD in the early 70s, the Ford Bronco, that's the one picture in the middle in the mid-70s, and the Dodge Ram Charger at the end of the 70s. Unfortunately, the photo on the right is an accident by this Ford Dodge Ram Charger that was in Attenstedt. And as you can see, the car was badly damaged, but no one was killed during this accident. Next, please. And the turning point was reached in 1980, because in 1979, the USM had 8 different types of mission cars, including several Opel Admiral, Opel Diplomat, and Opel Senator. 2 years later, in 1981, the first 4 Mercedes 280 G Wagons were part of the fleet. And this, as we will see later, was the perfect car for the mission job. Next, please. All 3 military liaison missions, the USMLM, Brixmis, and the French, were convinced by the performance of the car and used it as a tour vehicle, not exclusively, but it was used as a tour vehicle until the end of the missions in 1990. As you can see on the photos, you could deal with it in deep mud. And also, if you want to have a cup of tea, like on the right photo in the Brixmis car, this car was convincing all 3 nations. And looking at the history of the mission cars in Great Britain and in France and in the United States, they always, during all the decades, used different kind of cars. The only Mercedes was the only mission car they all 3 used. It was a Mercedes sedan they used for liaison reason and tour reasons, but later on it was simply and only the Mercedes G Wagen. Next, please. And here you can see some photos of mission cars that I took, and it just to name a few special modifications. You have a roof hatch, and that was round on the British car and on the French car, and it was square in USMLM cars. You have an extra battery, and this all 3 had an extra battery. Next, please. They all had electric winch and a front protection, and they all have an extra tank. In the middle photos, you can see the 2 opening for the extra tank behind the wheel. And they all have a single seat in the back. Next, please. And this is one of our artifacts we have at the museum, and this is the original Mission G Wagen. And it is in the background. You can see a couple of tanks, which is also we also stored in our storing room. But this is the G Wagen, and behind the radiator grill, you'll be able to see the 2 infrared lamps. So talking about infrared lamps, so that means at some point they're operating the car blackout. So only the driver who has infrared goggles could see anything. But the guy next to him, was probably terribly afraid because he didn't see anything if they're driving high speed in an East German forest. This is another special device that those mission cars had. Next, please. Yeah, and then look inside. It's most 80% of it is fabricated by the Mercedes company, but you can see those two black boxes on the right photo below with all the special switches. And Joe will later on tell you a bit more about those special switches. Next, please. The three mission cars were not all the same. So the American, British, and French working very close together doing their mission job, exchanging thoughts, exchanging information. But at some point, they do not exchange what they all had for special items in their cars. And that also differs. So, for example, the French were the only ones who had a special underbody protection. The bricksmiths, the British, had a tartan roof. So, what you need a tartan roof for? So, in the early morning or in the winter times, the roof of the car got pretty slippery, and because they like to take photos standing on the roof of their car, the British decided it's more safe if we have a tartan roof, so our soldiers would not slept on the roof in winter times. And the Americans, I mentioned it, had a square roof hatch. So as you can see on the photo, both could look out of the roof hatch and observe from the top. Next, please. Yes, so the perfect car for this demanding job, that is definitely the G Wagen. And even though it needed the winch sometimes, as you can see here on the left photo, we're proud to have one very rare original mission car in the Allied Museum's collection. And just to give you a hint, and if you're living in Arizona, in Fort Huachaca in Arizona, this is they're housing the U.S. Army Intelligence Center. They also have an original U.S. mission car from Berlin, and they received it directly from Berlin. So all the special items and the special equipment is still in that car that was on display in Fort Huachaca many, many years ago. I don't know if it's still on display, but I'm pretty certain they still have it in their collection. And they're probably as proud as we are that we have one of those very, very rare original G Wagons the mission was using in the Allied Museum's collection. Next, please. So, if you're interested in more, Joe will tell you more about the work of the USML mission and to talk a bit more about the special switches and the winch and the stuff. And if you would like to see the mission in the context of intelligence collecting in Berlin as a whole, you're welcome to browse through the book that Sven Felix Kellerhoff and I wrote a couple of years ago, and it's called Capital of Spies. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernd. I'm going to take a little bit of what Mark said and a little bit what Bernd said, and we're going to tell you what it was like on the ground. I was a tour officer from 1988 till the mission shut down in 1991. So next slide, please. So the vehicle was truly a workhorse, as Bernd has said, and why did we need a workhorse? Well, if you look at these nice pictures, they kind of look, hey, isn't that nice? The one on the left is a Soviet caretaker. in most of their bivouac sites and alert sites and things like that. You'd have guys like this guy right here and his dog they actually took care of that particular site. One of their jobs was to keep us out. And of course, that's where we wanted to go because that's where all the intelligence was. We wanted to know what the Soviets were up to. What are they doing right now? What kind of equipment are they using? And is there a difference? Is there a change in any of that? So these are the places that we wanted to be. Their job was to keep us out, and if they couldn't keep us out, then their job was to detain us somehow. So while this picture shows one guy, there were oftentimes at least two, if not more, there. And if they saw us there, they tried to trap us because the biggest thing they could do, we were in East Germany from 36 to 48 hours at a time. And if they could waste our time by just holding us in place, they succeeded. Picture on the right is a Soviet self-propelled artillery piece. Nice picture, but what I want you to think about is how close the person who took that picture had to be to this piece of equipment. So the key thing was, like Bernd said, we needed a vehicle that was reliable, that could get us out of sticky situations, and it was an extremely good off-road vehicle. Next slide, please. So this is a picture that Bernd had. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on some of the things. Like Bernd said, Mercedes gave us the top of the line vehicle. It had the biggest engine, the best transmission. It had skid plates underneath to make it as truly off-road as they could. We had differential locks. We call them Diffie locks, and we'll talk more about those in a couple slides. But what that did, that was a piece of the transmission where we could actually pull a lever, and that lever would lock the front wheels. Another lever would lock the back wheels, so the wheels would not spin independently. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So then we got it. Then we got the vehicle, and then our guys, our mechanics, put in about $50,000 worth of additional equipment. And when we got them, it was several weeks before we got it, before we got the vehicle and the vehicle's operational to take into East Germany. As Bernd said, we had a roof hatch for the reasons that Bernd mentioned, for observation and security. When the tour officer was out on the ground, the tour NCO was up in that hatch looking for any bad guys out there. A large fuel tank. When we would stop for gas in East Germany, the gas station attendants were bound to call the Stasi and tell us that there was a mission car there. And so what we did is we had an extremely large fuel tank that allowed us to get about 900 kilometers, a little over 400 miles to a tank of gas. And that just helped us from having to stop and be reported. Just as a side note, what we would oftentimes do is when we stopped for gas, we would give the gas station attendant Marlboro cigarettes or something that we had in the hopes that he would either not call the Stasi at all or delay that call. Switches, this is a really interesting point here. If you look in the picture, that area, that's square rectangular, the red rectangle at the bottom, that's a series of toggle switches. And basically they controlled all the electrical function of the vehicle. There were about eight switches on there, a couple interesting ones. If we're in that situation where you saw the Soviet caretaker there, and we're trying to be really as stealth as we can, we didn't want anything to happen that might tell the Soviets we were there, because the G Wagen, when it's idling or driving at very low speeds, it's very, very quiet. And so what we would do, one of those switches controlled the horn, because the last thing you wanted at that point was the tour NCO to accidentally bump the horn with his elbow or something like that and say, "Hey guys, we're here." Another interesting switch on there was at night, what we could do is we could shut off the whole right bank of lights, the right headlight, the right tail light, the brake light, all that. So in the dark, we looked like a motorcycle driving down the road. And then we also had under the hood, we had a couple infrared lights. And what that allowed us to do was, in using night vision goggles, the driver could turn on the infrared lights and then put on his night vision goggles, and we could be driving down the road at high speed. And high speed, I mean like 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, and nobody would see us. So that was a great tool for us when we were trying to get into some sensitive areas or get out quickly of some sensitive areas. If you look at the top the top red rectangle, that's called a trip master. And this is this is before GPS. We didn't have anything like that. So it was all maps and driving and keeping track of how many miles you went. So especially in times of limited visibility or night, um, the tour officer is looking at the map and he's saying, in about 500 meters, we're going to take a right on this dirt trail. And what the tour NCO would do is he'd just reset the trip master there. And when we got close to 500 meters, we were both of us looking for where that trail was. So that was a key piece of our equipment. Next slide, please. Now, any piece of equipment is only as good as the operator. We had a tour officer who sat in the right seat. The tour NCO sat in the left seat was the driver. We had specific duties between us. These guys I can't speak highly enough of these guys. There was a very selective recruiting process. They had to have proven success from whatever unit they came from. Since we were operating in East Germany, in a German-speaking country, their language skills had to be very, very good. The tour NCO was the German linguist, the tour officer was the Russian linguist. So if we got in trouble with either of those people groups who spoke those languages, we could try and talk our way out of it. We all, but especially them, had to know every single piece of Soviet equipment, inside, outside, whatever intelligence that we had. And the key for that is, one of the reasons was, let's just say, if you look back at that first picture we saw, that Soviet self-propelled artillery piece, if all of a sudden on the outside there was a new bump, well, that told us that, hey, there's something new on the inside. So we had to look at anything new that might have appeared on those that might indicate that, hey, there's something different going on with this vehicle now. They were, like I said, they were the drivers. That was one of their special duties. We sent them to a bunch of driving courses, something starting with like defensive, an easy one like defensive driving, to anti-terrorist, and finally we sent them to a school that was the Porsche training track down in Stuttgart. It was a high-speed test track where they learned how to do J turns, high-speed turns, and work on wet pavement, because on cobblestone roads, they get just a little wet and they are extremely slick. So the tour NCO had to know exactly how to control that vehicle. And then once I'd been through all that, then I had my own confidence building exercise where I would take these guys on. And there was a place in East Germany where there was a creek, and then behind it was an extremely steep hill. And I would say, okay, take me, let's go to the top of that hill. So they had to cross the creek and then go up this really, like I said, really steep incline. And every time they would never make it the first time. And I just let them play with the vehicle a little bit to see what the capabilities were. And then finally I would say, okay, now you listen to me. And when I say hit it, you hit it, and you hit it to the metal. And everybody at the end, they made it through the creek and they made it up that steep incline so fast, some of them, that we actually got a little air under the wheels going up that incline and we made it to the top. So that was a great way for them they had the head knowledge of the vehicle, but it was a great way for them to learn how the vehicle responded, because the last thing you want to do when you're in a dicey situation is have an operator who doesn't know how to properly operate the vehicle. Next slide, please. So, like Mark said, Mark drew attention to the bilateral agreements that provided for a different number of personnel for the Brits, the French, and the Americans. Well, that had direct impact on our equipment and how we toured. The G Wagen, as Bernd said, the Brits had 4, the French had 4. We also had 4. I'll explain why we had 4 in a second. But the vehicle that we used the most often was a 2-door vehicle, and that was because we didn't need. We only toured with 2 people, and so we didn't need that third seat for a third passenger. Now, what that made us do is that we had to do more with less. So in this picture right here, this is a tour officer, and if you look in that yellow circle up behind him, like I said, we didn't have the liberty of having a third tour person who could sit in that third seat and take video. So what we did is we hard mounted it up right behind the driver. So that's an indication, that's an example of how we had to change our touring technique to be able to tour with 2 people and not 3. All right, next slide, please. Now here's the difference. It doesn't probably look like much to you, but if you look on the U.S. vehicle on the left, there's only one door there. The vehicle on the right, that's the Brits having their tea there, and there's two doors there. The second door was for that third seat in the back that Bernd mentioned, and that's where their third tour officer would sit. We didn't have that third seat, so we went to a two-door. And you think, well, what's the big difference? Well, every one of our tour NCOs who drove, they would tell you that they would take a two-door over a four-door any day of the week because it was so much more maneuverable. And we did have, as I mentioned earlier, we did have four doors. We only used those on training tours when we had to have a seat for the trainee in the back so he could watch the experienced guys in the front, how they toured. And then if there was also a very, very sensitive mission where we had to take an extra tour officer out to conduct that mission, then we would go forward. But predominantly, probably 98% of the time, we were in a two-wheeled vehicle. Next slide, please. Now we got stuck. It just happened. You go off-road and you're bound to get stuck. So this is the progression of getting unstuck. So on the hard road, we were in two-wheel drive. As soon as we went off-road, we went into four-wheel drive. Now the differential locks, if we got stuck, couldn't get out with four-wheel drive, we would pull those differential levers and that would lock all four wheels together. And hopefully that would get us out. If we still couldn't get out, then we had the electric winch, and as long as there was something close by that we could winch off of, we could get out. Now, this picture right here that I put, that's clearly not an operational picture. Every year we had an annual competition with our fellow missions. This particular event right here was the G Wagen winching contest. Now, what it shows here, it's a little hard to see in the slide, but the gentleman on the far right in the blue, if you look down about his foreleg, there's a red circle there. That circle is showing the manual winch. And then the gentleman on the left, if you look between his legs, that's actually a steel plate with several holes in it. And he's hanging on to these large pins or spikes. And this is the dead man. So if we were out and there was nothing to winch off of, which was a terrible place to be, honestly, what we would do is we'd pull this out. We would drive those stakes all the way into the ground. Now they're not all the way into the ground here because we're trying to get that G Wagen up as fast as we can. But they were all the way. We drive them all the way into the ground, and then we would have the fun of trying to winch that vehicle out with that hand winch. Not too much fun. A lot of work, and you really didn't want to have to use this if you were in bad guy territory. Next slide, please. The slide on the left is a typical Soviet tank trail. So if you can imagine that pick any U.S. military base you can think of. Let's say we're in Fort Liberty, which used to be Fort Bragg. Well, our job was to get in there. And we couldn't go to the front door and knock on the door and say, "Hey, Ivan, we'd like to look at your training today." What we had to do was we would figure out some way to get in the back. And after years and years of doing this, we knew how to get in. And so we would go into these places and we could be in there for hours. This picture on the left, that's a Soviet tank trail where their vehicles, most of them like tanks and that artillery piece I showed you, they're tracked vehicles, and they just tore up these roads. Well, we get a little vehicle like the G Wagen with wheels, and a tracked vehicle could catch a G Wagen in a second on these tank trails. So we had to be very careful. So this poor guy on the right, that was his training tour, and you can see he is mired up to the bottom of the door. He's stuck. Well, that's the last thing that you want to happen when you're out in bad guy territory on one of these tank trails or even a smaller trail. So, and just to show you kind of some of the camaraderie, it was a small unit. We just had not many of us, but this picture showed up on the board in the hallway, and we always had, like I said, we had this great camaraderie, but we poked fun at each other too. So this kind of embarrassed this poor guy here who was on one of his first training tours. So, next slide, please. So in summary, we had a great vehicle that was operated by some highly, highly confident, tremendous personnel.
All right. Thank you all so much. That was really fascinating. Mark and I are exchanging lots of glances here in the studio about things that were particularly delightful. So we've got some interesting questions for each of you. Two of them kind of wrapped together, which was what happened to all these vehicles? And then Catherine Kane, our VP of Exhibitions, who we went together and met Bernd at the Allied Museum in the spring, chimed in with a question saying, would you be surprised to know that there are two 1990 high mileage G Wagons for sale on Auto Trader for over $100,000 US right now? So what happened to them? Is there a strong market? Should I be investing in G Wagons?
Well, I can tell you, I stayed in Berlin for about a year and a half after the mission shut down, and the Berlin Brigade's intelligence section, they got one or two of them, and but what they before they got them, they took all the fun stuff out of them, all that post factory stuff. They took all of that out, and it was not very. How can I say this? We looked at these workhorses, what they used to do, and now we see guys just kind of driving around the street. You know, it's like you've harnessed the Bronco here. You know, you've harnessed this wild horse, and it's like shuddering just to go do something fun again.
So basically, the cars were sold after they were not used anymore. Because the cars were paid by German tax money, the Germans sold the cars, but obviously without any special equipment, as Joe just mentioned. You know, the car has been stripped, and if you buy one at the nearest car dealer that's coming from the Mercedes company, it's more or less the same one that you will receive after it was stripped with all the special equipment, but you pay a higher price for the history of this car. And that's the reason why they are now maybe, I doubt if they're worth $100,000, but at least people trying to get the money because there's a history with the car, and the history has to do with intelligence collection, the history has to do with espionage, and that's the reason why they asked for so much money.
Oh, interesting question just came in. Were there any special clandestine storage areas in any of these vehicles? Can you answer?
Sure. Clandestine storage. Well, so I mean, everything is unclassified now. So clandestine storage, I guess we could. Are we meaning like grabbing people and bringing
Oh,
them
no,
through?
I'm sorry. Well, if you want to elaborate on where you put people you grabbed, that is very exciting.
No.
No, but this was
Let me just
more
tell you right now, we didn't do that.
excellent. Good to hear. More about if there were secret films or documents, something that in case you ran into trouble, you wanted to have carefully secreted away. Oh, Bernd's ready to go.
I think I have to mention that the car itself had a special status. So Stasi, NVA soldiers or Russians were not allowed to enter the car by force. So therefore, you can keep it in the car, and it's probably safe in the car. In very, very, very rare reasons, as I said, windows had been smashed, but there were no officers and no soldiers inside. So if they park the car and it's out of sight, and they were able to smash the windows, get the cameras out, whatever they could find, but that was never done when people were still inside, because the cars has a special political status, like an embassy. It was U.S. territory, the car itself. So that's the reason why you don't need special place to hide anything, because the other side wasn't able to get in.
Yeah, and to that point, we always had to have somebody in the vehicle, or the vehicle had to always be like, if we both got out, it was because we were right next to the vehicle for that very reason, because the camera equipment, the intelligence gathering that we had done, all those types of things, that was critical intelligence gathering information, and we didn't want anybody to get to that.
Joel, what is the most exciting discovery or intelligence collection operation that you experienced, if you can tell us?
Well, you know, we're collecting all the time. So it's like, gee, what did we find out? Here's kind of a funny story, and I'll try and make it as brief as I can. We had heard that the Soviet artillery battery was going from 6 vehicles to 7. Okay, so that was one of the things that we were looking for. We are inside a Soviet training area, and we drive in, and I just battery happens to be we drive right by him. And one of the key things about the vehicle was that it looked on first look, it looked very much like a Soviet Jeep, kind of the same color, same boxy shape. So if somebody just gave you the one look, you were usually pretty good, and you could continue on because it's really probably hard to imagine that we're in the heart of the Soviet training area, but that's what we did. And so I counted them quickly, and I told our touring guy, I said, "There's 7 there, I think." And so we went about that same day, and we were in that training area for a long time, looking at this equipment, that equipment, this training, everything's going on. And then you really didn't ever want to go back out the same way you came in, just in case. Well, I told the tour agency, I said, we got to go back. We got to go back and make sure there's 7 and not 6, because I didn't want to report some incorrect intelligence value. And so he looks at me and he says, okay. And so we go back and we drive by it. Sure enough, there's 7 there. And like I said, they got the first look, but then we got the second look. And as soon as you got the second look, that means they're looking closely to see, is this ours or is this theirs? And it was theirs. Um, and what that started, all the smoke started coming out of the vehicles. They ran their vehicles, and basically they chased us all the way out. And so think about that picture I showed you that had the Soviet tank trail. We're driving down those, and we've got this tube of this artillery piece. It looked like it was going to scratch our back window. It was so close. So that was a fun one. A lot more to that story, but that's the essence of it.
Well, here is I don't know if, well, really, Joel might comment on this as well, but maybe particularly for Bernd or Mark, if you're willing to talk about Major Nicholson's death in 1985 when he was away from the vehicle. And if you would, whoever answers that, or if you answer that in tandem, can you give just a tiny nutshell on that case or that incident?
Joel, can you talk to that?
Actually, Bernd wrote about it. He
Okay.
probably does more than I do.
Better.
So Nicholson was wants to look at a tank garage in Ludwigslust together with his driver Jesse Schatz. And as George said, they were only 2. So Schatz was waiting in the car. Nicholson was outside. And you keep in mind that mission members were always unarmed. They never carry any weapons. And everybody who dealt with the missions knew that.
Bernd, if I might interrupt for 1 second, the reason we did that, we never wanted to give the Soviets an excuse to shoot first, or to shoot, saying, well, they pulled out their weapon first and then would take a shot at us. So that was one of the reasons why we never carried any weapons.
Yes. And for reasons we don't know, we know the name of the Russian soldier now, but we never interviewed him because he was sent directly back to Soviet Union after the incident. So for some reason, the Russian sentry, maybe he fell asleep or he was so surprised and he didn't have any other orders. He was starting to shoot at the car and at Nicholson. And Nicholson's trying to reach the car. He has to run back, and the driver was putting the gear backwards to make the distance shorter. But unfortunately, Nicholson was shot and was badly wounded. And at the end, he was deadly wounded because he didn't get first aid. His driver could not give him a first aid because the sentry outside pointed the gun at him and said, "If you get out of the car, I'll also shoot you." So Nicholson was not dead on the spot, but he died later because of his injuries. And the first thing is shooting at the guy is one point, but after he was hit by bullets, not giving him first aid so that he died was the second crime, to be honest. Yes. And later on, it was a big thing. It was a much, much bigger thing than the French mission driver who died 1 year before. I would say it salopp and say the French want to put it under the carpet, but the Americans did not. It was very, very important for Americans not to put that dead officer in Ludwigslust in East Germany under the carpet. And believe it or not, it was also on the agenda when President Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik. One of the points they were discussing there was the shooting of Major Nichols in East Germany.
I remember there was an article in Newsweek about it, which, the threshold for what Newsweek back in the day would write about was pretty high. And I remember as a teenager reading that article.
Wow. Well, Bernd, I have to ask you, I think you told me this when we visited, and if you said it today and I missed it, Mark and I were doing some technical stuff at one point, but I thought you told me that the lights could be switched. Joel mentioned the lights being switched, so it looked like the G Wagen was a motorcycle. Do I remember that the lights could be switched so the car that you have could be a Trabant? And Trabants are very dear to my heart.
So basically, a friend of mine collected some of the mission cars, and don't know if it was on the American or on the British one, but one which was labeled Trabi.
That wasn't ours.
It was not yours? Okay, so it must be the British. So one was labeled Trabi. So keep in mind that let's say at night, if you see a Mercedes G Wagen in the distance of 2 or 3 kilometers in the GDR, you would recognize this car at night as being a Western car because the lights were so different. And so they had a switch to get the impression that they don't have the shiny H4 light, which all the cars in the Western countries have, but instead they have a much, much dimmer light and a much smaller light. And I said they have a special switch, and it was labeled Trabi.
Well, I need one of those G Wagons at our next parade of Trabants next November. I think it would qualify as the glitziest Trabant.
An honorary Trabant.
An honorary Trabant. I'm going to do 2 more questions if we can slip them in. The first, can you address whether there were SIGINT or ELINT collection capabilities in these vehicles or on these missions?
We didn't have any. We had a ground team and an air team. We split in the mission. The ground team, we were looking basically on the ground, and the air team were looking anything above that, so aircraft and things like that. They had some things that they would monitor airport traffic for when planes were coming in. So because they had to sit in one spot, so they were extremely vulnerable. They'd sit on the end of a runway, and they're just kind of sitting ducks. So they had to be really, really mindful of where they were and when they were there. So they were able to listen to to tower traffic and things like that, and to better help them accomplish their mission. But that was about it.
I've seen a lot of photos taken from East German mobile antenna systems or stable antenna systems. So antenna systems, any kind of antenna systems were photographed and even drawn by hand. I've seen in the British National Archive, I've seen a drawing from 1953. Probably the lack of photo equipment, I don't know, but he did a perfect drawn of a mobile antenna system in the GDI in 1953. But they were pretty interested in any kind of antenna they would see on the way, and they would take a photo of it.
Yeah, sorry, man. I may have misunderstood your question. I thought you meant, do we have anything that we were pulling in their signals or
I think that is what the questioner meant, but I think it's pretty interesting to hear about the sketching of the antenna. So,
Yeah, if it was Soviet and it was equipment, we took a picture of it, or more.
or more. All right. Very last question for all and sundry. Is there any sort of agreement like this happening anywhere in the world today? Can you imagine anything like this happening?
That's a tough one. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind, and it's a pretty pale version, would be some of the things that the United Nations does with its various peacekeeping missions around the world, which often have rights to be in places like before the war started, the current war started, up on the Golan Heights, for instance, or things analogous to that. But I'm not aware of anything as muscular and aggressive, if you will, as what the Allied, and for that matter, the Soviet military liaison missions were doing. I don't know if either of my other friends here do, but that's my thought.
I think those bilateral agreements between those different nations were only possible in Germany because you have these 4 occupying nations, and if they have bilateral agreements, that's very unusual elsewhere in the world. And but talking about the bilateral agreements, I just want to mention and to make clear that talking about these bilateral agreements, the only party that was not included were the East Germans and the West Germans. But the territory where all that took place was East Germany and West Germany. So that's also a funny footnote that these Germans could not do anything against the missions, but constantly begging and asking the Soviet Union to just quit this bilateral agreements. But the Soviet Union didn't do it because they had their advantage in West Germany.
Well, our time is up, and we're getting lots of very nice comments in the Q&A, and I will second all those comments, which say this was so informative and entertaining, and I'm kind of a car person, so I love this deep dive on cars. And I want to thank the Allied Museum for this virtual partnership, and Joel for joining us with the firsthand account, and Mark for doing so many things when I ask him if he's willing to join us on things. He can't get away, even though he tried to retire from the Spy Museum. He can't get away. So thanks, everyone. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel if you want to see it again or share it with friends. And we have a variety of programs coming up that are virtual or in person, and you can look for them on our website. Or if you just feel like, wow, I really want to make an end-of-year contribution to the Spy Museum, and so they can keep doing these wonderful free programs, well, I'm not going to stop you. So thanks, everyone, for being here. We'll see you soon. Take good care.